Did you know? Hideo Kojima wanted to let players keep rats as pets in Metal Gear Solid. Rats play a small but significant role in the game's final build, like following them through air ducts and finding one that ate a key. But, according to Kojima, he originally wanted them to play an even bigger role. He said the rats were a way of adding reality to the game, and to create the atmosphere within the base. The enemy soldiers eat food and they have leftovers, which attracts the rats. I actually wanted to put more rats in. Another thing I wanted to do was reassign names to individual rats, and these rats could then be raised as pets. Alaska is a very cold place, and when Snake first goes into the base, the rats are the first life forms he encounters. So I think they're a very important element in the game. When Snake returns to Shadow Moses 9 years later in Metal Gear Solid 4, there's an optional codec conversation where Snake refers to the rats as his friends, which leaves Otacon thoroughly confused. Ostensibly, Snake says they're his friends because they helped him through the vents 9 years earlier, but it may also have been a nod to the fact that Snake was originally meant to keep them as pets. There was also a rat-based Easter egg in the shootout with Sniper Wolf. According to Kojima, in that scene initially I had this little cheat in there where if you kept shooting the rats, you'd get bigger and bigger rats. It was in there for a while, but then I felt like it was too much of a joke, so I took it out. But in the final game, instead of the rats growing, there's a secret where Colonel Campbell calls and tells you to stop shooting them and get back to the mission. And if you ignore his orders, Naomi calls and says you must be pretty sick to torture small animals. Kojima also said his favorite scene is the Jeep escape, although it was originally planned to be a bit different and would let players choose between the driver's seat and the gun on the back. It didn't work out though, so in the game's final build, Snake only shoots. All three of these stories come from a 4-page interview published in the May 1999 issue of Computer and Video Games Magazine. These are just a few examples of cut content from the series, but Kojima once said he could only get about 60% of his ideas in Metal Gear Solid, and had to abandon lots more throughout the entire series. So, to learn about them all, DidYouKnowGaming dug through about 800 retro magazines looking for interviews, sifted through various documents, and conducted a few exclusive interviews with developers. So sit back, grab some rations, and check out the strangest and most ambitious ideas that never made it into the Metal Gear series. One cut idea was a singing mariachi who advised Snake on battle tactics. In the May 99 issue of official UK PlayStation Magazine, an interviewer asked Kojima about cut content and he told them, there was another character, Mariachi. He was an analyst and every time you fight you were supposed to talk to this guy and he'd tell you the best way to defeat your enemy. And every time you asked for this guy, he sang a song. The song was in Spanish, like with a flamenco guitar. It was ridiculous, and he laughed. And a year later, he told Edge magazine he knew a lot about mercenaries and you could contact him through the codec. He'd give you information about a particular mercenary, but only after he sang a song, and you'd have to sit through the entire song before he'd give the information. He didn't make it into the game. When Snake lands on Shadow Moses, he only has 2 items in his possession, a scope and a pack of cigarettes. Snake's cigarettes were somewhat controversial, but Konami was cool with it because smoking drains your health, which let players know smoking's bad for you. The game also features a lung cancer warning, although Snake brushes it off because cigarettes taste good. But besides looking cool, smoking only comes in useful once in the entire game, letting you blow smoke on invisible lasers so you can sneak past them. However, in the very first issue of Arcade Magazine, Kojima explained that he actually wanted to add more incentives for Snake to light up, saying, "We were planning to include more of the cigarettes in the gameplay. For example, at one point you would be stuck in a cell with no way out. The trick would be to befriend the guard by giving him a cigarette, but this idea didn't make it into the final game." When the series made the jump to PlayStation 2, despite the upgrade in hardware, Kojima said his unlimited desire to create still surpassed what the PS2 was capable of, and some ideas had to be thrown out. One of the more interesting mechanics was real-time whisker shaving, where your facial hair would grow based on the PS2's internal clock, and you could choose between shaving or letting it grow out naturally. But real-time facial hair ultimately got cut and replaced with a couple Easter eggs instead. In the final build, the shaver's pretty useless, and it's easy to miss and finish the game without it. But if you manage to find the shaver early on, Raiden gives it to Snake in the cutscene when they first meet. Snake usually has whiskers when you see him later, but he'll appear clean-shaven if you gave him the shaver, and his whiskers will actually grow back 1 week later, as tracked by the PS2's internal clock, which is reflected in codec calls as well as his in-game model. During Metal Gear Solid 4's development, Kojima said he'd try to bring back real-time whisker shaving, but in the end, the mechanic never found its way into the series at all. Kojima is famous for playing mind tricks on his fans, but one of those tricks got removed from MGS2 because even the developers were getting confused. According to Kojima, the original cell phone only vibrated and didn't ring. I wanted to fool the player by making him think he was incurring damage when actually all that was happening was that the phone was ringing. But then, so many of our staff who didn't know about the cell phone making the controller vibrate thought the vibration was a bug. That's why we added a ringing sound. In all the international versions, the ringtone sounds like this. but the Japanese version got an exclusive MGS theme chiptune ringtone. The FAMAS assault rifle was iconic in the original Metal Gear Solid, but its inclusion kinda didn't make sense, since it's a type of gun almost exclusively used by French soldiers and not American Special Forces, or Russians either for that matter. The FAMAS was originally planned for the sequel as well, and Snake can be seen with it in early trailers, but Kojima was pressured to remove it for realism purposes. In an interview with EGM, he said, "The game was first developed with the FAMAS, but we turned it into the M4 to be consistent with the story. Graphics supervisor Yoji Shinkawa and others who know a lot about guns begged us to drop the FAMAS. We had to drop all the polygon models and character motions involving the FAMAS as a result. What a waste." Fortunately, it wasn't a complete waste, since it was cut so late in development. The FAMAS can still be found in MGS2's Trial Edition, a demo bundled with Zone of the Enders, also produced by Kojima. With a cheat code, you can still unlock it and use it throughout the entire demo. In that same interview, Kojima goes on to say that there were at least 4 more items scrapped in MGS2's development, like the SPP-1M underwater pistol, a real-life gun developed by the Soviet Union in the 1960s, which held 4 bullets and had an effective range of about 50 feet firing underwater. Data for this underwater pistol can still be found in an early demo of the Trial Edition. You can actually use the SPP-1M with hacks, but the gun was never rendered, so it's invisible. Kojima also said X-ray goggles were cut, which presumably would have let you see through enemies in walls. There was also the decoy balloon, which eventually made its way into Metal Gear Solid 5. Kojima also mentioned a penguin suit, which actually had some concept art made public, with a Japanese caption that says, "Antarctic Snake." The way it's written, it's clearly a reference to Antarctic Adventure, a 1983 game made by Konami, where you race a penguin to far-flung research stations all around Antarctica. Its sequel, Penguin Adventure, released 3 years later and was the first game Kojima ever worked on. Penguin suit concept art was included in the Document of Metal Gear Solid 2, an interactive making-of documentary released a year after the game itself. The document also includes these experimental 3D models for Snake and Mei Ling, along with 4 characters who got cut out entirely, like Chinaman, a boss who, despite being Vietnamese, brags that he's, quote, more Chinese than the Chinese. He was sold as a child to a New Yorker, then grew up getting discriminated against, so he seeks revenge on New York and America in general. According to Kojima, Chinaman would have had a dragon tattoo that came to life when he dove into water, and part of the boss battle would have taken place underwater, with Chinaman sending sharks after you. He ended up getting cut when Kojima's team ran out of time, although he later appeared in the official MGS2 comic book adaptation, along with another cut character named Old Boy. Old Boy's over 100 years old and fought for the Germans in World War II, and taught Big Boss everything he knows about the art of combat. Piranhas and boss battles against the President's security team and great white sharks were also mentioned in the document, but didn't appear in the final game. And a couple more cut characters who weren't quite as fleshed out. A girl named Max, who saved your game and loved to quote William Shakespeare, and Doc, a scientist who developed Arsenal Gear's AI and provided radio support. Both would eventually be exposed as AI constructs, just like the Colonel. But the most interesting part of the document is Kojima's original vision for MGS2, which he called the Grand Game Plan. About 90% of the plan made it into the final game, but the remaining 10% got scrapped. It features some interesting unused ideas, like that Kojima originally wanted to call it Metal Gear Solid 3, which would symbolize the 3 tallest skyscrapers in New York City and stir up buzz as fans would wonder what happened to Metal Gear Solid 2. The document also boasts of doing something that's never been done in a video game before: real-time split-screen cutscenes, where half the screen shows a cinematic while the player continues playing the game on the other half. The Grand Game Plan says there would have been 3 of them: the bomb disposal sequence with Raiden, Snake, and Peter Stillman, the sniper sequence surrounding Emma's rescue, and dismantling the C4 in the underwater strut. After examining titles that succeeded in America, Kojima said it was essential they include a multiplayer mode, where 2 players could either gun each other down or engage in a stealth-driven game of hide-and-seek. There was also going to be a Mantis mode for repeat playthroughs of the main campaign. By wearing the Mantis mask, you could hear the inner thoughts of NPCs to tell when they were lying, and better understand the game's complicated plot. There's also a scrapped location that was going to be at the bottom of the offshore plant surrounded by glass walls, and players could casually observe marine life, virtually explore the ocean floor with a remote-controlled mini-sub, and take pictures of what they saw. But this had no bearing on anything else in the game. Possibly the biggest change was Kojima's vision for MGS2's beginning and ending. The document explains in great detail how the first act begins with Iraq being suspected of developing their own Metal Gear, which prompts the United Nations to demand access for nuclear inspections. But Iraq refuses, so the US responds by threatening airstrikes. The final act would have seen a battle on Wall Street and half the financial district destroyed. But all of these plot points started to sound a bit too similar to what was happening in the real world during the game's development, particularly the 9/11 attacks, so the story was changed to avoid controversy. Not long after MGS2 hit store shelves, Kojima and his mentor Shigeru Miyamoto decided to bring the series to GameCube. Kojima's team was too busy to do it themselves, so they pitched it to Silicon Knights president Dennis Dyack. Silicon Knights had just finished Eternal Darkness, a critically acclaimed psychological horror published by Nintendo. Together, the three of them set out to remake the original Metal Gear Solid, beefed up with enhancements introduced in the sequel. In 2004, it released as Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. Mid-development, the game was announced to have a GameCube to GBA connectivity, but none of those features made it into the final game. When asked about it later, Dyack said, "We had some really interesting concepts and some co-op mode play ideas. For example, you could have a special radar on the GBA. You could have some kind of spy camera that you could, say, drop down and monitor a certain area for guards. There were all kinds of things we talked about, but at the end of the day, we just looked at the amount of resources and time it would take, and unfortunately, we just couldn't do it." Unable to find any more details in old magazines, now almost 20 years later, DidYouKnowGaming tracked down Dennis Dyack to ask how those features might have worked. Dyack said they were tinkering with the idea of giving Snake a camera that you could leave in a room or drive around on wheels, and monitor the video feed on GBA. As far as co-op, the second player's primary purpose would have been aiding Snake indirectly, kinda like how Tingle did in The Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker, providing stuff like items and info. That's about all he remembered, so DidYouKnowGaming decided to get in contact with Twin Snake's project leader, Kerry Murray. He said they also wanted to give players the option of having codec calls and the map on GBA. It could have saved players from fumbling in menus and stopping and starting so much, but Silicon Knights just didn't have enough time or manpower to implement it before release date. Murray's team had a lot of ideas they would have liked to have added in, but the budget and deadline were set. And because there were three major stakeholders, Konami, Nintendo, and Silicon Knights, no single entity had the authority to call for a delay or allocate more funds. They had exactly the amount of resources required for the job they were given, remaking MGS1 with the features of MGS2. But everyone involved, including Kojima and Miyamoto, did have a few more ideas they would have loved to have squeezed in. Eternal Darkness's main draw was its sanity effects, like tricking the player into thinking their TV was on the fritz, or that they got duped into buying a demo and not the full game. One of the team's main priorities was giving some of these abilities to Psycho Mantis, but they just didn't have the resources. DidYouKnowGaming asked if there had ever been any intention to add VR missions into Twin Snakes, and Murray said, "I think there was some talk about VR missions. That probably would have come first, before GBA connectivity, but VR was a lower priority as well. I think the way that worked was, well, let's see if we have any bandwidth towards the end and we can hook that up later. And we might have even started working on VR, but we didn't have time for that either, so we had to ship the game without the feature." He also said they wanted to add a split-screen mode where a second player took the role of a boss. The example he gave was Sniper Wolf, and they'd duke it out with Snake, like the Versus mode Kojima wanted in MGS2. But multiplayer would have required even more resources than their other ideas, so ultimately, they had no choice but to give up on that one as well. Now, let's move on to Metal Gear Solid 3. The first game was on PS1, the second on PS2, and Kojima originally wanted to develop the third for PS3. He waited and waited for Sony to release their next-generation console, but it took so long that he couldn't wait any longer and eventually settled for PlayStation 2. In the end, he said there were hundreds of ideas he couldn't fit into the game, many of them because there just wasn't enough space. A PS3 dual-layer Blu-ray holds 50 gigabytes, but a PS2 single-layer disc can't even hold 5 gigs, and the lack of storage meant Kojima had to make some cuts. He said, "We overflowed the confines of a DVD and had to cut tons of stuff in order to squeeze it onto the disc. We had to get rid of a few cutscenes simply because there wasn't room. We also had to get rid of several radio stations, codec frequencies dedicated to music. Some of these secret stations are still in the game, but we had to cut a lot of the tunes that we'd recorded for them. One of the few stations to survive in the final game was Healing Radio, a frequency that plays pleasant tunes that replenish your stamina. We wanted to make a station that would be the reverse of this, tunes so bad that they lower lower your stamina. We planned to sing the songs ourselves, but that never happened. We were just going to take turns butchering the Snake Eater opening theme karaoke style, but we simply didn't have room. Several other ideas ended up getting cut, like 2 bosses Kojima described as a lizard man and a moss guy. He even said they wanted to implement functionality with the PS2 Eye toy. Kojima never specified, but the Eye toy might have been meant for making custom camouflage. When the game was ported to the Nintendo 3DS 8 years later, they added the camouflage photography system, which let you take pictures of stuff in the real world and turn them into Snake's camo. But his team wasn't just short on space, they were also running short on time, and just barely managed to release the game 1 week before Black Friday, the state's biggest shopping day of the year. Unlike the previous 2 games, Metal Gear 3 didn't have a soliton radar to track your enemies, because the tech didn't exist back in the 60s. If he'd had more time, Kojima said he would have liked to design another game mode that did have a radar, but without making the game too easy. Some interesting camouflage mechanics also got scrapped, like being able to paint Snake's face manually any way you like, but they couldn't get the controls to feel natural and replaced the mechanic with preset templates. During development, Kojima also said they'd made over 100 camo patterns, but only half of them made it onto the final game. One he talked about on several occasions was the bloody camo, which was covered in blood and fake wounds, so if you lied next to some dead bodies, enemy soldiers would think Snake was dead too and leave him alone. This camo got cut from Metal Gear 3, but was brought back as the corpse camo in the next game. We don't want to dwell too long on Portable Ops, because despite having Solid in its title, it wasn't directed by Kojima himself, and he said it wasn't entirely part of the core series canon. But Kojima did mention one interesting idea in early 2006, while Portable Ops and Metal Gear Solid 4 were both still in development. In an interview with EGM, he said he wanted to let players move their teams back and forth between Portable Ops and MGS4's online mode, but he seems to indicate the gap in release dates was going to make it difficult to implement the level of connectivity between games. It's not entirely clear how that would have worked, but that might be because Metal Gear Solid 4's premise changed pretty dramatically during development, and in that sense, you could argue MGS4 has more scrapped ideas than any other game in the series. In early 2006, Kojima explained the MGS4's premise to EGM. Here, he said how the player could take several different approaches to completing missions that would have a deep impact on the game's story. If players chose to team up with Country C and went into battle where Countries A and B were fighting, they might prefer to sneak in, then flee unnoticed. But if the player got spotted by Country A or B, you'll have to fight them, or both countries if they spot you. You could even team up with a country if what you needed was in their territory, but that would mean becoming their ally and by default, the enemy of another country. Or you could just wait until the war's over and grab what you need after. Or you could destroy a country's forces in the current mission, and with no army, the conflict would simply not exist in the next. In Kojima's words, so, the new thing is that Snake will definitely have to go to the battlefield, and he will have the opportunity to interfere with the war, and that interference will affect the next stages. This is the new plot. Later that year, he told official PlayStation Magazine, "You may decide to stick with Nation A or B in the game's war, or you could destroy both. You could also choose not to ally with either country." In the game's final build, Snake could help out the rebels and engage in a little trading, but he could never ally with the PMCs, and the overall premise of playing off countries A, B, and C was left almost entirely on the cutting room floor. Kojima also wanted civilians to play a larger role on the battlefield, maybe taking up arms to protect their families, but that idea got scrapped as well. It seems MGS4 was originally planned as an entirely different kind of game, and lost some of its bigger ideas during its lengthy development. Even the ending turned out different. At TGS 2007, Kojima said, "One of my ideas for MGS4's ending was that since Snake and Otacon are breaking the law in order to fulfill their justice, I was thinking of having them turn themselves in, and for the sake of justice, they'd get convicted and executed by the law. But all of my staff went against the idea, so I decided not to go with that. The ending they went with instead was after Big Boss dies at the boss's grave, Snake decides to spend what little time he has left living in peace." Even though a PS3 Blu-ray could hold 50 gigs of storage, Kojima still couldn't fit everything he wanted into Metal Gear Solid 4. He originally planned to include both the English and Japanese language tracks on both versions of the game so fans could listen to the one they liked best, but had to settle for one language per disc. He told Famitsu, "For us, we're still not satisfied with the quality we can do. You know, there's not capacity space. There's not enough space at all." And he laughed. "We always talked about where to cut and what to compress. But there's actually some voice recordings still on the disc that got dummied out, which indicates Snake was originally planned to have access to a lot more of Shadow Moses than what got used in the game. Like this cut codec call that would have taken place in the woman's restroom."
You're in a ladies' room, for Pete's sake. Why would any guy be in there reminiscing unless he was some kind of...
Look, This is where Meryl and I first really talked.
Another codec call reveals Snake would have had access to the Wolf Dog Cave, the comm towers, and presumably the areas in between, and maybe some other parts of the island as well.
Behind the bookcase, there's a door hidden back there.
Oh, the one you were talking about upstairs.
It leads to the cave where the wolf dogs lived.
There were also a few cut characters revealed in the Japan-exclusive Metal Gear Solid 4 Master Artworks collection, like a Russian soldier named Adam. DidYouKnowGaming had his description translated, and it says the Russian military was originally meant to get involved in the fighting, but the story got too complicated, so the character got axed. This likely ties back into the game's original concept focused on countries A, B, and C. Adam might have had something to do with Ocelot, whose real name is Adamska. Ocelot's also half Russian, but there's not enough information on record to know if there's any connection. Johnny Sasaki was the soldier guarding Snake's cell in Metal Gear 3, and it's his grandson who marries Meryl towards the end of Metal Gear Solid 4. Grandpa Johnny was initially planned to attend his grandson's wedding, but didn't make it in. And the last cut character was Snake Man, whom we don't get much information about, except that he gets his name from the tentacles coming out of his Solidus-like suit. When Metal Gear Solid 4 hit store shelves, many fans noticed that the series' main musical theme, the one you're hearing now, was noticeably absent from the game's soundtrack. According to the game's composer, Norihiko Hibino, that's because Konami faced legal problems after some Russians claimed the series' theme was plagiarized, stolen from a Soviet composer that, interestingly enough, composed it for a 1964 film called Metal. The Metal Gear team denied the plagiarism accusations, but the suits at Konami didn't want to mess with the Russians, so the musical motif was absent not only from MGS4, but also removed from Portable Ops. In fact, it was even cut from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, where leftover code reveals the MGS main theme was once planned for that game as well.
Finally, we can leave all that crap in San Geronimo behind.
Moving on to the next game in the series, Peace Walker. Might not have been a numbered sequel, but according to Kojima Productions, it's as mainline as it gets. And it was originally planned to be revealed at E3 2009 as Metal Gear Solid 5, Peace Walker. But the number 5 ended up getting cut simply due to it being a handheld game. Instead of the usual linear adventure, Peace Walker's made up of 153 independent missions, but hiding in the original data is 24 extra ops that go unused, but are still playable with hacks. They generally have the same objectives as many other extra ops, like extracting prisoners with Fulton Recovery, demolishing targets with C4, and eliminating all enemy soldiers in a given area. These 24 unused ops would have boosted the total mission count by 15%, but for whatever reason, they got cut. The final game has 4 AI weapons: the Pupa, Chrysalis, Cocoon, and Peace Walker. But the Peace Walker official artworks collection reveals 4 earlier AIs that got scrapped in development. DidYouKnowGaming translated the notes written by concept artist Chihoko Uchiyama, who says there was originally supposed to be 1 AI weapon each for land, air, sea, as well as the Peace Walker, and they were all named after women from classic fiction. The land weapon was named after Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and Uchiyama says it's based on a real-life Sphinx tank. The water weapon was Odette, named for the princess in the Russian ballet Swan Lake. It's based on a Nautilus submarine, although its appearance would have stayed hidden under the surface. The air weapon was named after Scarlet in Gone with the Wind, and looked like a mix between a YB Flying Wind and a B-2 stealth bomber. And Sleeping Beauty was the Peace Walker. It was meant to be the Patriot's ultimate AI, but kept on sleeping after its completion. This next slice of Peace Walker cut content is really more of a case of censorship, which only occurred in the Japanese version. According to Kojima, the PSP is supported by the younger generation. That is why we avoided the animation of blood spill. However, a scene that's critical and essential to the series was pointed out by the rating board. He's talking about the torture scene in Mission 20, which would have knocked the game up to a D rating by the Japanese rating board, which is equivalent to M for mature. But dialogue tweaks and changing the electric torture to tickling torture meant Konami secured the less restrictive C rating. Here's the scene as it appeared in every country except Japan. And here's the same scene in Japan, censored. There actually is historical record of tickle torture being used in Japan, but it was pretty rare and mostly reserved for women. Historical precedent or not, Kojima wasn't too happy having his art censored in his own country, saying, "There's tolerance for fantasy games, but for games where you show war or real violence between people, you apparently can't complain about anything." With this, it seems impossible to communicate something meaningful through games. And now we arrive at the franchise finale, Metal Gear Solid 5. As Kojima's relationship with Konami grew increasingly strained, he ultimately left the company company just 1 month after the game hit store shelves. In early 2015, Kojima said fans were going to complain that MGS5 was too big to complete, but his sudden departure later that year, along with the game's abrupt ending and copy-pasted mission structure in the late game, left a lot of fans feeling it was released unfinished. But it's unclear just how much content got cut because of Kojima's falling out with Konami, and how much was scrapped for the same reasons all his games released with lots of unused ideas. Kojima hasn't fully clarified, so whether or not MGS5 was actually unfinished remains controversial even to this day.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
To be fair, some content appears to have been cut for artistic reasons. A good chunk of the game gets spent watching the gradual construction of the battle gear, because it was originally planned as a buddy similar to Quiet and D-Dog, as evidenced by the game's internal data. But in the game's final build, it was relegated to a much smaller role. According to Kojima, the battle gear created by Emmerich is used in the combat deployment missions, and to be honest, my plan was to make it available on the actual field, but I noticed that its presence disrupted the gameplay balance during first test sessions, so I eventually had to remove it from the game. Concept art for an older version of Chico can be found in the game's art book, revealing how he would have appeared in Phantom Pain, severely disfigured from the helicopter crash at the end of Ground Zeroes. An early script leaked online says Chico survived the crash and ended up in Zaire, and at some point Amanda would ask Snake to go kill him. Combined with this concept art of the buddy system, some fans think that in a similar sequence of events as Quiet, there would have been a boss fight against Chico, that he'd joined Snake as a buddy. But the authenticity of that leaked script can't be confirmed, or if it's really even Chico in that buddy concept art. So take that last part with a grain of salt. Regardless, it appears Chico was written out of Phantom Pain voluntarily and never made it out of the concept phase. But there was also a lot of content that looks to have been cut involuntarily. The bonus disc bundled with the collector's edition featured a 20-minute video showing off the Kingdom of the Flies, a scrapped 51st mission with 30% of its cutscenes completed. Mission 51 would have tied up some loose story threads, especially for Eli, and despite not making it into the final game, is still considered canon since it's included in Phantom Pain's endgame timeline. Kojima's biggest undelivered promise probably has to be the return to Camp Omega, the military base where Ground Zeroes takes place. In a 2014 interview with Jeff Keighley, Kojima said, "People who own Ground Zeroes will be able to play a different mission at Camp Omega in the Phantom Pain. That's the current plan. There's something of a big feature involved. It's never been done in the games industry before, so I can't go into detail about it, but I think when you experience it for yourselves, you'll be surprised. It's something that's only possible through video games." There are still traces of Camp Omega in Phantom Pain's internal data, but the game never actually takes you there. Data mining also reveals this unused title card for Chapter 3, Peace. Some fans believe Chapter 3, Peace, would have added tons of new missions and plot points, but others think it was never meant as anything more than an ending title card. Like how after the last story mission in Death Stranding, a title card for Episode 15, Tomorrow is in Your Hands, appears on screen, letting the player know they've finished the story, while still allowing them to run around the sandbox and complete special deliveries. Whatever Chapter 3 actually is, Konami's been hinting for years that nuclear disarmament in MGS5 Online is the key to unlocking it. Several groups have sprung up over the years to try and steal everyone else's nukes and attain peace, but so far their efforts have been in vain. Disarmament was originally going to be covered in this video, but the deeper the rabbit hole got, the more truly wild info DidYouKnowGaming unearthed, and the full story grew well outside the bounds of this video. So, look out a few weeks from now for the 7-year story of nuclear abolition, what it could mean for the single-player campaign, and how Konami rigged it all from the very beginning. Did you also know Snake was going to have nightmares in Metal Gear Solid 3, where you'd have to play Gradius? Or that Kojima originally wanted Paz to die before the events in Ground Zeroes, and Chico would have been forced to watch her corpse decompose? For more Metal Gear facts, check out the videos on screen. Let us know in the comments what videos you'd like covered in the future. And before we go, a big shout out to Retro Mags, Out of Print Archive, Nitroid, and all the folks who made this video possible. I'm David Hayter. Thanks for watching.